All right, we're going to continue our work with Singer in this video. So first of all, I know it's tempting to just power through all the stuff, but please make sure you are giving these readings and their corresponding content their due attention. So please don't watch this video 2 seconds after the last one. Your goal is to chew these things over for a while. As Nietzsche said, good philosophy needs to be ruminated. You have to chew on it for a bit. So I'm not going to review all of the Singer from last time, but let's just focus on the prevention principles. So remember, he identified a strong and weak prevention principle, and it helps to think in terms of what would I need to do to uphold it. The strong prevention principle says that if I can prevent an extreme bad without losing comparable good, that I ought to do so. What would it take to uphold that? I would have to prevent as many extreme bads as I could without losing something comparable. So if I can save a life and it just cost me an organ, I should do it. But again, he doesn't push the strong prevention principle. He thinks it's correct, but it's also a hard sell. And frankly, if he could just sell you on the weak prevention principle, the world would be a pretty awesome place. So the weak prevention principle says instead that I should prevent as many extreme bads as I can without sacrificing anything of moral value. So what would I have to do to prevent that, or sorry, to uphold that, is to prevent as many extreme bads as I could without cutting into things that have moral value. So functionally, that's might sound a little wishy-washy. Well, what has moral value? It's simple. There's so much waste in the world that if it's a borderline case, you could just give it to you. Well, is my kid's college education of moral worth? Probably. I have a bad back, so I need special shoes. Fine, keep them, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just so much waste in the world, especially in the U.S. You'll notice Singer focuses on the U.S. that these kind of decisions don't have to be agonizing. So he'll give you the borderline cases, or at least he should. So that's what we need to do. But if we do that, the world would be a very, very different place because of all the things we do that could prevent that if we saved money, especially, and put it towards preventing an extreme bad, we could do so. So, a couple of reminders. I talk about saving lives a lot, but he says an extreme bad. So, for instance, there in the developing world, fistulas are very common. Pardon the graphicness, but this is where during childbirth a tear opens between the uterus and the rectum, and so the net result is um, that the young woman is dripping excrement from her lady parts for the rest of her life. So they become ostracized. The husband doesn't want anything to do with them, etc. And so just something as simple as fixing that could really be a life changer, and that might be an extreme bad as well. Those happen very commonly because it's very happens a lot when the mother is too young, not finished developing before they have children. So that's why it's more common in that way. Anyway, so those are the extreme bads. Those are, and then, so that's the argument. We talked last time in terms of the very intuitive pawn case. But here's the thing people like their stuff. And so there's a lot of knee jerk reactions that we need to get out of the way. And the chapter that was assigned for reading in The Life You Can Save goes through a lot of those. And so, just very briefly, I'm going to talk about some of the concerns and some of the responses. So, a first knee jerk reaction might be to say, well, wait a minute. Don't I have a right to spend what I want on what I want? The Singer response is twofold. One, no, you actually don't. For instance, you can't spend your money to hire a hitman, etc. So there are limitations on what you have a right to spend your hard-earned money on. But I think more importantly, we're not talking rights anyway. We're talking ethics. He's not saying you're not allowed to spend money in other ways. He's saying you have a moral obligation, though, to do certain things with that money. But he does raise one other really important point, and I encourage you to think about this point more generally than just in the singer context because it's an important one. You did nothing, I promise you, you did nothing to deserve being born in the US. And yet, doing so is a lot like hitting a lottery. You're born into a system where there's a bunch of infrastructure already invested. You get free and deeply discounted education. You have upward growth potential, etc. And so there's a sense in which what the money you make in your lifetime, the vast majority of it, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say more than 80% of it, is due to the luck of being born in the US. If you were born instead in Togo, you wouldn't have what you had. And so there's also an important sense in which you don't necessarily have a claim on all of that because it's really hard to say that you earn being born in the US. And yet that's where a lot of your funds come from. So think of that not only in relation to the singer, but think of that in life because people seem to forget that most of what you make in your lifetime is unearned in an important sense. The second very common knee-jerk reaction is someone might ask, well, how can I owe people I haven't wronged? Once more, there's a two-part answer. One, we have very, very often wronged these people. So Singer mentions carbon footprint. The more industrial we are, the more we're harming non-industrialized nations. Also, we exploit their resources instead of using our own. Factory fishing takes tons and tons of food away from them. And here's a big one, government subsidies. If you've ever been to a coffee shop or something like that and seen a free trade sign, it's because the following happens. U.S. crops can't compete internationally price-wise, and so the government pays farmers to raise a certain crop that allows them to lower the prices and therefore sell at a cheaper price that undercuts the competition. But what did you just do there? The government just stepped in to kill people in foreign countries. It's an odd way to think about it, but that's what happens. If the government is subsidizing an undercutting of prices, that means that farmers who can only live by selling what they have can't sell what they have. And so there are many senses in which we have harmed or at least contributed to the harm of other countries. But more importantly, in some senses, we can owe people we haven't wronged. Here's a simple case. I certainly owe the bank money who I borrowed to buy my car. Um, I haven't wronged them and they haven't wronged me, but I owe them money. But a more general one is if you think of those notions like paying forward. Well, the previous generation made sure that I was born into a world that had drinkable water, breathable air, and enough resources to live on. And the notion of paying forward is instead of paying back. I cannot pay back the previous generation, but I might think that I have accepted a burden or responsibility to make sure that the next generation has similar opportunities. So there are very deep moral considerations of, yeah, of course you could owe people you haven't harmed. Paying forward is kind of a key example there. Another kind of objection is the if everyone did that, dot, dot, dot. Now, first of all, you can't raise an objection without finishing your sentence. And so the challenge is finish that sentence. If everyone did this, the world would be a wonderful place. I don't know. The children wouldn't die of starvation and easily preventable poverty related issues. Um, but there's a couple more things to say. First of all, remember utilitarians are the scientists of ethics, and talking about things that don't actually happen seem irrelevant. Well, everyone's not doing it. So who cares what the result would be if we lived in a completely alternate universe? But more importantly, that's also a very, very strong conventionalist thinking. Because um, what happens? Well, I'm a little worse off. They're a lot better. But you might say, well, wait a minute, doesn't this damage the U.S. economy? Nope. If you pause and think about the economic effects, if everybody in the US started giving, they'd actually be positive, not negative, for the following reason. Um, no one's suggesting we send giant barges full of cash to developing nations. That's not what we're talking about. Instead, companies like Oxfam use their money to send things like resources, such as building infrastructure, such as providing food, etc. And so, what happens, Singer's model, so to speak, if we are upholding the prevention principle, we're spending more, which any economist will tell you actually drastically benefits the economy. Well, people are taking money that would have otherwise been in savings and spending it on goods that are produced in the US and then shared to other nations. So the economic impact is actually a good one if you just pause and think it through. So that's another knee-jerk reaction we have to get rid of. Now, of course, certain industries would suffer. The billion-dollar yacht industry would probably take some hits if everybody was doing this, as would a lot of other luxury goods, but jobs would move rather than disappear because a lot more people would be buying solar panels and food and medicine and things like that. So it would be a change in the economy for sure, but it's not clear there would be anything like a negative. So those are kind of these three just knee-jerk reactions to the Singer argument that are irrelevant. A couple more things, though, that are just these kind of standard worries. You might say, well, wait a minute. How do I know my money's actually going to life-saving charities? You could consult the great god Google. Any charitable organization in the U.S. Must disclose what their money goes to. So you can log on to a website and see how much of their money goes towards administration and how much actually goes towards life-saving causes. So Oxfam usually hovers at the 95, 96%, with the rest going to administration, for instance. But here's the other thing. If you are too lazy to even do that, Singer himself has assembled a nice list for you about which organizations are the most efficient at saving lives. And so you could just go onto his website and look at that information. A couple other worries. You might say, well, excuse me a second. So you might say, well, wait a minute, aren't they going to become dependent? And the answer is not usually. People confuse popular ideas and rhetoric in the US with what actually happens. So, first of all, pretty much zero people are dying in the US from starvation. Again, I say pretty much zero because, of course, there's a few. But generally, where the people need the help is elsewhere. And so we're not talking about people who are living in a comfortable home who are dependent on welfare. We're talking over 1 billion people in the world live under the extreme poverty line, which is to say they're living on less than the equivalent of $2 a day in the U.S. So that is adjusted for U.S. economy. And you give these people food, they're not going to say, well, I guess that just gives me a reason to keep living on $2 a day instead of improving my lot in life. No, that's not what happens. They don't starve to death. They're doing anything they can to improve their lot. They just don't have the resources. But second of all, and I think this is important, you might say, well, what about the give a man a fish, feed him for a day thing? Utilitarians say the most good for the most people. So of course that's short term and long term. So of course, part of these charitable organizations is to give infrastructure and education and teaching them ways in which they can eventually be self-sustaining. But then also, imagine the pond case. Imagine you're like, oh my gosh, you're drowning. I'm going to go teach your brother how to swim. No, that's first you save the life, and then you teach them to be stable on their own. And once more, from a very utilitarian standpoint, that's also good for the U.S. So if you're really a conventionalist about these things, if the world is a more stable place and the world has more trading partners, etc., that's actually a really good thing for both the economy and safety. So there's a lot of wins here that people are skipping over, just trying to raise these kind of knee-jerk reactions to Singer. And I keep saying knee-jerk reactions because, again, I'm not saying there are no objections to Singer, and I'm not saying that there aren't any problems with the account, but the usual suspects, the things that people just go to right away, seem to come from just either popular rhetoric or not really thinking through things through at a particularly deep level, rather than being reflective of the actual situations. So bear that in mind. Uh, Last thing I want to say on the Singer, notice he focuses on the U.S. a lot. That's not because the U.S. is a bunch of jerks. It's because we tend to be a little wasteful, but more importantly, we also have a false picture of ourselves. So because we were moral authorities 60 years ago, we think we still are now. Um, but instead, we're actually one of the least charitable nations. So um, Singer gives a couple of numbers in that regard. Uh, Actually, let me start it this way. Singer points out that most Americans believe a contradiction. You can say something like, well, how much money should go to foreign aid, more or less? And they'll say, less. Oh, what would be a good amount? I don't know, 1%. We give way less than 1%. And so there's there's a contradiction in belief there. Um, Now, if we talk about individual giving, the average U.S. citizen gives 18 cents per $100, and the global average is 46 cents. So we're significantly less than half as charitable as we think we are. In terms of actual countries giving, uh, as a percentage of income, we are second to last in the developed world, ahead of Greece, and that might have changed by now because when that number was recorded, that was right after Greece's economy had collapsed. And so, and then lastly, the U.S. does this weird thing with its foreign aid, like bribe dictators is considered foreign aid, so we might give billions of dollars to some Middle Eastern baron to sell us oil for cheaper, and that counts as foreign aid. So we also have to kind of watch for where the foreign aid goes. Now, all of this stuff is to say, again, the Singer's not just not attacking the U.S. per se. He's saying, look, we need to be aware of these things. As ethical human beings, we need to act accordingly. We need to, if the government's doing something that's costing lives, such as government subsidies, we should object. We should write our congressman, etc. And we should certainly be informed about where U.S. money goes. But ultimately, his goal is talking about the individual, what you can do, what life you can save. And so the main reason I think he's mentioning a lot of these kind of failures by the U.S. government is to remind us that the following line doesn't work. Oh, the U.S. has foreign aid, so I don't need to do my part. No, that's not going to work for the reasons we just talked about. So that's kind of this last knee-jerk reaction that no, the government actually isn't terribly charitable, and in fact, those numbers keep getting cut over and over and over in the last 3 years, and so we can't say that we've somehow fulfilled our moral duties by paying our taxes either. So that's the general idea behind the Singer. Again, the main point of me having you read this is so you actually think through what Singer's trying to commit us to and to get past these kind of knee-jerk reactions that don't necessarily disrupt his account in any way. And so we can have a good, legitimate conversation about whether Singer is correct or not and what that means for us. All right, see you next time.